To further our discussion of the public discourse analysis project, this will be a discussion of the examples that were assigned for reading. As I note in the announcement for this week, you'll want to read the examples first. Otherwise, this presentation is not going to make a lot of sense. I'm not really going to summarize those examples so much as I'll be pointing out the good things that they do and also a few of the more problematic things to do that you can learn from too. Starting with the gentrification essay. This is the essay that looks at the popular discourse in regards to gentrification. And if you don't know what gentrification is, it would take a little bit longer to explain here than I would really want to give to it, given that my primary goal is to talk about public discourse. But give it a Google, and you'll see that it makes sense quite quickly why it is that the author of this essay discusses it exactly the way he does. So, good things this essay does. We start with a nuanced main idea. It's not overly simple, and yet it's clear, and mainly it gives the rest of the essay something to do, which is what any main idea should do. It advances a thesis statement having to do specifically with the ethical quality of public discourse having to do with its main topic. And this is a really important thing. Remember that the overall main idea of this essay, in fact, is to look at something, either a topic or a mediator of discussion, and talk about whether or not that thing leads to ethical public discourse. Finally, just for the purposes of this slide, our first essay, the gentrification essay, discusses subject matter from sellers that will be useful to the rest of the coming essay later. Here's one good example of applying sellers. The author of the gentrification essay writes, during one protest on September 23rd, 2019, over 100 protesters took to the streets of Brooklyn, New York, and chanted that, quote, gentrification is violence against people of color, and, quote, city planning, stop your racist planning, quoted in Krogan, which is ethical as they conducted this protest peacefully and garnered a great deal of awareness. You'll notice that I've taken the last phrase of that and made it bold. It is that last phrase that forms the ties between this slide and the content on it and one of the concepts from Mortimer Seller's essay that talks about one of the reasons that public discourse might be perverted or subverted. Here we have another example of applying sellers. Again, this author writes, quote, new legislation that will empower these lower socioeconomical individuals in terms of housing that they pay for and the decisions that are made regarding their complex fits with what Sellers says all ethical discourse should do. Develop all citizens' capacities and interests towards harmony and mutual benefit without exploiting any individuals for the unreciprocated benefit of other favored factions or groups. And I actually do like the way that this one works even better than the first one because we've got the direct link to Sellers right here. We're not just pointing out the aspects of our topic that match up with the Sellers essay, we've actually got Sellers' idea right next to it. Now, there are some things to avoid from this essay. The writer of the essay is doing several things really well, but it turns out that his wording structure, his sentence structure, and even paragraph structure tends to be on the overly complicated side, and we can kind of see how that falls apart here and there. In this case, I've got several examples of overly complex sentence structure. Quote, gentrification is an ongoing housing issue that affects, and notice that that should be AFFECTS, but it isn't, largely lower income individuals, and it has large implications for the social dynamic between the wealthy and the poor, often in, excuse me, often in a way that results in anger or sorrow. Now, all that is true. There is no part of that that isn't accurate. It all makes sense, so to speak, if you take the time to kind of tease it out. But it takes that time to tease out. The complexity of the sentence structure means that the reader's going to have to take some additional time and effort to make sense of it. Now, take that and compare it to a simplified version of it. So, verses. Gentrification is a housing issue that mainly affects lower income people. It can cause social tension between those affected and the wealthy people who often own the gentrified properties. You can be pretty confident that the second version of this is simply going to transmit its meaning far more effectively than the first one, largely because of the fact that the language used is simple enough that it conveys the message without getting in the way of it. Now, looking at complex wording, first example here. The protesters also advocate for new legislation that will empower these lower socioeconomical individuals in terms of housing that they pay for and the decisions that are made regarding their complex. One of the rules of thumb that I like to use for when something is too complex is whether or not I need to stop and take a breath to figure out what comes next. That happens at least once in the example that's taken directly from the essay. Now, here's the simplified version of it. The protesters also support new legislation that will allow them more control over decisions that will affect their housing. Straightforward, about half the length, and it doesn't take any additional gathering of one's attention to figure out how to say the rest of it. It's all there, and it all makes sense in current form. Another example here, again, overly complex wording. With this, and this is highlighted because of the fact that due to the complex wording of this section, this comes directly from the conclusion, it's darn near impossible to figure out what this is referring to. There are just so many other ideas that come right before it. It's hard to know exactly whatever it is that this is with. And the issue isn't just on principle. I'm not just talking about this as a clarity error in general. The issue is that this is the conclusion. And so this should be where the essay makes it very simple exactly what it is that's making any discussion between lower income individuals and the people who own gentrified properties possible. It's not, though. We don't know what this is. So, anyway, with this, the hope to finally provide lower income individuals with affordable and livable homes becomes feasible. Without it, the process of gentrification will catalyze very rapidly until more and more low income individuals are displaced from their home and affordable housing for all becomes a thing of the past. Now, my simplified version skips over whatever it's with because, again, I can't really simplify what I don't understand. So this comes up to what would be just after with this, the simple version then. Affordable housing for lower income people becomes feasible, but without it, gentrification will happen more quickly and affordable housing will become harder for even those who need to find it. Other issues include generally getting lost in the weeds, that's metaphorically. Sometimes this essay can become difficult to continue to read because the essay itself doesn't seem to remember exactly where it's going and why it's doing what it's doing. Notice the fact, for example, that the word discourse itself, and given the topic of the essay, this would need to be something that we talk about a lot, doesn't show up anywhere from the top of page 3 to two-thirds of the way down page 5. So we're looking at almost 2 pages that don't make direct reference to the topic of the essay at all. Otherwise, there are some issues with paragraphing structure and content, including excessively long paragraphs, such as the one that goes from the top of 4 to the bottom of 5. And within paragraphs, transition words that imply contradiction or a different direction of reasoning. And this can be really problematic because within a paragraph, there should be one point made about one thing. If, though, inside of a paragraph, the reader is sent in several different directions due to all of the transition words like but, although, however, nevertheless, that paragraph is just doing too many different things for its structure to make sense in regards to what it's actually talking about. And just to get paragraph structure as a whole, a paragraph is there to be a kind of a structural indication for the reader of where a certain idea begins, is developed, and ends. If that's not the case, if several different ideas are developed in the space of a single paragraph, then really paragraphing structure stops mattering. And we end up with a situation where a reader just doesn't have a very useful tool in order to set their expectations for what they're about to read anymore. Other proofreading problems that just fall into the category of clarity and correctness include commonly, commonly confused words. These include affect versus effect. Um, if we're going to be referring to an expert over and over again, as this essay would need to do, we want to make sure that we get that expert's name correct. This essay spells sellers with 3 L's instead of 2 on a pretty regular basis. That's distracting. We have lots of paragraphs that are, pardon me, lots of sentences that like to begin with which and as, and that's fine once in a while as a way of drawing attention to what you're saying. But which and as are words that would have to be in the middle of a sentence usually. And if we begin sentences with them, it 99% of the time means that those are usually fragments. And that's exactly what these turn out to be. Finally, again, there are words that are just not quite correct that actually could be caught with a little bit of proofreading, particularly verbal proofreading. So we go through and we're not just running our eyes across the lines, but we are instead speaking it out loud, preferably to someone else, if that's really going to work well. And that would certainly help us to catch things like of versus off. To get to the other example, the vaccine essay, there are a lot of things that are worth looking at here as done right. The topic and the main idea are clearly identified. This essay focuses only on misinformation as the source of unethical discourse, and that focus serves it really well. The essay, points to clear, concrete effects of the breakdown of public discourse having to do with vaccines. It refers to researched material as a way of supporting the point it makes. It refers to researched material to help narrow its focus and its discussion of those that are most at fault for problematic public discourse. And finally, it refers to researched material in support of examining Facebook as a bad actor. And that gives us the last section of the essay, probably the most important one. Where contradictory transitions are used, they begin whole paragraphs, and this is huge, right? We don't have the issue that we did in the last essay where these were peppered throughout the paragraph and we ended up going in several different directions, back and forth and back and forth. Instead, where a contradictory transition begins a paragraph, it signals that we're simply talking about something that isn't working exactly the same way as the paragraph before it, and that's just fine. Now, the author is really an organizing consciousness here rather than the speaker of the thing. One of the things that I like a lot about this essay is the way that the author is making her point known by virtue of how she puts together the external sources she finds. And this is one of the hallmarks of really good academic writing. So I encourage you to take a look at the essay again and note how that works. It's done really well. We have simple and direct sentences. They are only as long as necessary in order to get the idea that they contain across. We have simple, clear wording. There's no wording that is simply chosen to sound good. And paragraphs make clear, explicit points having to do with the main idea. You can always see exactly what those points are. Finishing up, if there's anything to learn from our vaccine discourse essay, it has to do with the way that the references page works. Starting with the way that article titles are formatted in APA format. The references page of this essay seems to assume that any title in APA should be italicized. It's not the way it works. If we're going to italicize anything, it's the large container. In other words, it's the larger publication that holds, for example, a single article. The article itself is just written as it would be, say, at the beginning of an article in a newspaper. First word capitalized, and that's all. After that, using the example of the newspaper again, the title of the newspaper would be italicized, as would the title of a book or an academic journal or any other publication that has articles within it. After that, take a look at the last citation. It seems to have been added after the rest. And as a result, it doesn't fit what the order of citations should be. And that order should be alphabetical based on the very first letter of the citation. So that's a discussion of the two example essays. Again, both contain many good things, both contain many things that are examples that we can learn from. Both contain things, though, that we could also learn from in terms of those aspects of the essays that might have held them back a little bit and kept them kept them from being as successful as they could be. That's the end of my discussion. Again, take a look at those essays after having listened to this. You'll see that they make that much more sense. And we'll talk soon. Take care.